A pilot once told his navigator, "If I say eject, don't say what, or you'll be talking to yourself." That line wasn't a joke, or rather, it was a joke. The kind you tell when the truth is so stark that humour is the only language left. Buccaneer crews passed it around like currency, pilot to navigator, squadron to squadron, decade after decade, until it became less a quip and more a creed. Because the men who flew the Blackburn Buccaneer understood something about their aircraft that no specification sheet ever bothered to spell out. At the altitudes they worked, ejection was a theoretical concept. The Martin Baker seats beneath them needed time and altitude to function. Time for the canopy to blow, time for the rocket to fire, time for the parachute to catch air. At 200 feet and 580 knots, there was no time. If something went catastrophically wrong, the pilot had a fraction of a second to recognize it, call the ejection, and pull the handle. The navigator, sitting behind and below with limited forward visibility, had even less. He couldn't see what was coming, he could only listen. And if he wasted a single syllable asking, "What?" well, he'd be talking to himself. December 8, 1970 proved the point with terrible precision. A Buccaneer S.1 suffered a catastrophic engine failure during low-level operations. The pilot ejected and survived. The navigator didn't make it. Killed not by the crash, but by a malfunction in the ejection sequence itself. An escape system that worked perfectly at 10,000 feet became a coin toss at 200. That incident crystallized what every Buccaneer crew already knew. Survival at operational altitude depended not on skill or courage, but on the physics of time, altitude, and the mechanical reliability of a pyrotechnic charge. Multiple Buccaneers were lost over the aircraft's service life to the hazards that haunt low-level operations. Controlled flight into terrain, bird strikes at high speed, spatial disorientation in the featureless grey of a North Sea approach. This phenomenon had caused the loss of 3 Buccaneers, and a Blackburn test crew had also been killed in related circumstances. Every crew knew the odds. They flew anyway, and the stories they left behind, the stories told not by them, but by the people who happened to be standing nearby when they went to work, are so strange, so escalating in their impossibility, that they sound like lies. They aren't. The Buccaneer was designed to fly lower than any jet before or since, and the proof isn't in the specifications. It's in the escalating impossibility of the stories told by the people who witnessed it. The Buccaneer existed because the Soviet Union built warships, specifically the Sverdlov-class cruisers, heavily armed, bristling with radar-directed anti-aircraft guns, capable of hunting convoys across the North Atlantic in a grim echo of the Bismarck. By 1952, the Royal Navy had reached a blunt conclusion. The only weapon guaranteed to sink one of these cruisers in a single pass was a tactical nuclear bomb, and the only way to deliver it against a ship defended by dozens of guns and standing combat air patrols was to fly so low the ship's own radar couldn't see you coming. Radar physics dictated the doctrine. At 200 feet above the sea, an aircraft approaching at high subsonic speed would remain invisible below the radar horizon until it was far too late for any defense to matter. In June 1952, the Naval Staff issued Requirement NA.39, a carrier-borne strike aircraft capable of sustained flight at transonic speeds at 200 feet, carrying a nuclear weapon beyond the radar coverage of any surface vessel afloat. The company that won the contract on July 5, 1955 was Blackburn Aircraft. Their factory sat at Brough in the East Riding of Yorkshire, And before anyone fires off a correction, yes, the town of Blackburn is in Lancashire, but the aircraft company's works were at Brough, and that's where every Buccaneer was built. The two share a name and nothing else, a confusion that has caught out more than one careless presenter. Before the Buccaneer, Blackburn had very little experience with jet aircraft design. Their previous masterwork was the Beverley Transport, which had all the aerodynamic grace of a double-decker bus. Nobody expected Brough to produce a legend. The aircraft that emerged on April 30th, 1960, maiden flight, 39 minutes, chief test pilot Derek Whitehead at the controls, flight test head Bernard Watson in the observer's seat, climbing to 17,000 feet, looked unremarkable from the outside. A mid-wing monoplane. An area-ruled fuselage pinched at the waist to cut transonic drag. Nothing flashy, but the elegance hid in what you couldn't see. A rotating bomb bay door, a cylindrical drum that turned to present the weapon to the airstream without ever opening a conventional bay, eliminating drag at the worst possible moment. An airframe engineered to absorb the relentless, bone-rattling turbulence of sustained low-level flight without slowly tearing itself apart. The Buccaneer wasn't fast, wasn't agile, wasn't pretty. At 580 knots and 200 feet, with a low-altitude combat radius of 400 nautical miles, it could do what nothing else on Earth could do, and it could do it again the next day. Its own designers called it the Blackburn Advanced Naval Aircraft, which they shortened to the acronym BANANA, one of the longest-running in-jokes in British aviation history. None of that matters to this story. Specifications are the territory of another documentary. The Buccaneer's proof lives in the people who were near it. Start at sea, because that's where the Buccaneer was born. The aircraft spent its early years aboard carriers, first the old Centaur class, then Eagle and Ark Royal. And its designed attack profile against surface ships required an approach at 200 feet or below, hugging the sea surface to stay beneath the target vessel's radar horizon before popping up at the last instant to release its weapon and diving back into the radar shadow of the water. During exercises, Buccaneers practiced these runs against friendly warships, searching for and attacking simulated targets, while the ships exercised their own defenses against incoming strike aircraft. The veterans who served on those ships tell a story that sounds like a hallucination. Sailors on the decks of warships looked down at Buccaneer pilots, not up, down. A man gripping the railing of a flight deck, staring over the edge, and seeing a jet aircraft pass below him. The pilot visible in the cockpit, at an altitude lower than the deck on which the sailor stood. The Buccaneer's attack profile required it to fly beneath the radar horizon of a Sverdlov-class cruiser, and a Sverdlov's radar antenna sat considerably lower than the flight deck of a British aircraft carrier. Physics mandated the altitude. Human beings just happened to be standing in the way. The image inverts everything you assume about the relationship between ships and aircraft. Jets fly over you, that's how it works, except Buccaneers didn't. From ships, the stories move to the water itself. Among the most extraordinary claims in Buccaneer lore, and the one that sounds least defensible until you understand the physics, is that the aircraft's passage at ultra-low altitude over the sea could physically lift swimmers from the surface. A large aircraft moving at high subsonic speed at extreme low altitude creates a pressure wave, a region of sharply reduced air pressure above and behind the airframe that generates significant suction on the surface below. Like holding your hand out a car window and feeling it pulled upward. Except the car weighs 20 tons and is doing 670 miles per hour. At 200 feet, these effects are noticeable. Below 200 feet, altitudes Buccaneer crews were known to reach during particularly spirited peacetime training near RAF Lossiemouth, the pressure differential becomes powerful enough to disturb anything not firmly anchored to the surface. A human body floating in water with no solid purchase is, aerodynamically speaking, a loose object. The story circulates widely among Buccaneer veterans and has long been tied to training routes off the Scottish coast near Lossiemouth, the base that became the Buccaneers' spiritual home after the aircraft transferred from naval to RAF service. Whether the swimmers rose an inch or a foot or not at all, the story endures because it captures something true about what the Buccaneer did to the world around it. Bizarre aerodynamic effects on surface objects aren't merely plausible at those heights. They're a predictable consequence of the physics involved. Then there are the nosebleeds. Sailors on ships subjected to close Buccaneer flybys during exercises reported bleeding from the nose, not from impact, not from debris, but from the acoustic shock of the aircraft's passage. 2 Rolls-Royce Spey engines and a large jet airframe screaming past at masthead height and high subsonic speed generates a wall of acoustic energy well above the threshold for physiological effects. Sinus pressure changes, nausea, epistaxis. The Buccaneer didn't merely fly past you, it happened to you. It left physical evidence of its passage on the bodies of people who were near it, an experience that went beyond seeing and hearing into something almost violent. Other jets were loud. The Buccaneer drew blood. The escalation continues inland. After the Royal Navy's carrier fleet was wound down through the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Buccaneer transferred to RAF service, and its primary base became RAF Lossiemouth on the Moray Firth coast in northeastern Scotland. From Lossiemouth, Buccaneers flew low-level training routes through the valleys and glens of the Highlands, exploiting the terrain for radar masking practice. Scotland's geography created something unique. Steep-sided valleys with settlements perched on hillsides above the valley floor. A Buccaneer flying at 250 feet above a glen floor passes well below a house sitting 400 feet up the hillside. The kitchen window of that house looks down on the aircraft as it thunders through. Families in the communities around those training routes tell these stories with warmth, not anger. They weren't the frustrated residents of a London flight path. Many had military connections of their own and understood what the aircraft was and what its crews trained for. The kitchen window Buccaneer is a memory people hold on to. A private spectacle, available only to those who happen to live in the right glen at the right moment. Children watched from gardens, washing shook on the line, tea rattled in cups. And below, threading between the hills, with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, the Buccaneer went about its work as if the valley belonged to it. Which, for those few seconds of shattering noise and displaced air, it did. Everything in this aircraft's story, the design philosophy, the crew culture, the impossible altitudes, the sailors and swimmers and Scottish hillsides, converges on one event. And it didn't happen in the grey skies over the North Sea. It happened in the blinding desert light of Nevada. Red flag. The United States Air Force's premier air combat training program ran out of Nellis Air Force Base near Las Vegas. Established in the mid-1970s after the dismal air-to-air kill ratios of Vietnam exposed a generation-wide gap in combat readiness, Red Flag was designed to give pilots their first 10 combat missions in a simulated environment so realistic it approached the lethality of the real thing, minus the actual dying. Foreign air forces received invitations, partly as alliance solidarity, partly because the USAF genuinely wanted to test its tactics against unfamiliar aircraft and doctrines. When the RAF sent Buccaneers to Red Flag in the late 1970s, nobody on the American side was prepared for the result. The Nevada Test and Training Range covers thousands of square miles of open desert, mountain ranges, dry lake beds, canyons, and the Buccaneers used it exactly the way they used the Scottish Highlands. They flew into the terrain and vanished. At 200 feet and below, hugging the contours of the desert floor at high subsonic speed, the Buccaneers blended into the ground clutter on every radar screen pointed at them. They became indistinguishable from the terrain itself. American F-15s and other fighters, designed and trained to engage targets at medium and high altitude, where their powerful radars gave them a decisive advantage, searched for aircraft that simply weren't there. Or rather, were there, but existed in a sliver of airspace that American equipment and doctrine weren't built to exploit. The Buccaneers penetrated their targets, delivered simulated weapons, escaped, did it again the next day, and the next. Low-flying Buccaneers proved to be more than a match for some of the most modern fighters in the world when operating at their designed altitude. That's not British nostalgia talking, that's the exercise record. An aircraft designed in the 1950s, powered by engines a generation behind anything in the USAF inventory, carrying no air-to-air weapons, possessing a radar cross-section that should have made it easy prey. This aircraft walked through the most sophisticated fighter defenses on the planet and came out clean on the other side, repeatedly, with a consistency that moved past impressive into something more uncomfortable for the hosts. According to squadron tradition, the success was commemorated with a special paint scheme applied to at least one participating aircraft, a visible, permanent record that the crews wore as a quiet badge of professional pride. The Buccaneers had performed splendidly, and the commemorative marking wasn't a taunt. Taunts are for people who need to convince you. This was a statement of fact, applied by men who'd proved something no specification sheet could ever convey. That flying low, flying fast, flying into the dirt and staying there worked against the best opposition on Earth. The Americans learned a lesson about assumptions that day. The British painted it on an aeroplane. Red Flag validated the Buccaneers' doctrine, but it also exposed the price of that doctrine. The brutal stresses of sustained low-level flight that made the aircraft so effective were simultaneously destroying the airframes from within. In February 1980, a Buccaneer broke apart in the air during a Red Flag exercise, a catastrophic wing fatigue failure that grounded the entire fleet pending inspections. Initially, investigators suspected a faulty wing bolt. Then, another Buccaneer broke up in the air during a subsequent Red Flag exercise, and the truth became clear. The constant hammering of low-level turbulence was fatiguing metal that had already endured thousands of hours of punishment no other airframe was asked to absorb. The aircraft that lived closest to the ground was being killed by the ground. Modifications were designed, inspections completed, and the Buccaneers returned to service. But every crew from that point forward knew the fleet was living on borrowed time, and each sortie below 250 feet was another microscopic crack in a wing spar. Even as the airframes aged, the Buccaneer kept finding work that nothing else could do. But the Buccaneer's most improbable chapter was yet to come, and it unfolded over the Iraqi desert in February 1991. When coalition forces launched Operation Desert Storm, the RAF's Tornado GR-1 fleet was tasked with destroying hardened Iraqi airfields using JP-233 runway denial weapons delivered at low level in the face of intense anti-aircraft fire. The results were devastating to the Tornadoes. Losses mounted, and the switch was made to medium-altitude precision bombing using laser-guided munitions. The problem was that the Tornadoes, in 1991, lacked their own laser designation capability. They needed another aircraft to illuminate the targets. The solution was an aircraft designed 39 years earlier to sink Soviet cruisers with nuclear weapons. Buccaneers were deployed to the Gulf, carrying laser designator pods. The Buccaneers flew into Iraqi airspace alongside the Tornadoes, designating targets with a steady laser beam, while the newer aircraft released their precision munitions, and delivering 48 laser-guided bombs themselves directly. An airframe conceived in 1952, first flown in 1960, designed for a mission that no longer existed against an enemy that no longer threatened. And it was still operationally essential, still doing something nothing else available could do quite as well. The Tornado was newer, faster, more expensive, more technologically sophisticated. It needed the Buccaneer to find its targets. There's a particular kind of vindication in that, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't require speeches or commemorative paint schemes. Buccaneers flew 216 operational sorties during Desert Storm. Every single one came home. Half a world away, the South African Air Force had already proven the Buccaneer in a different kind of war. The SAAF operated the Buccaneer, receiving 16 aircraft for 24 Squadron, one of which was lost during the delivery flight, leaving 15 in service, and flew them in combat during the long bush wars along the Angolan border. The South African Buccaneers were maintained through ingenuity and improvisation, flying long after their British counterparts had been pensioned off. A tribute to the fundamental soundness of an airframe built for one very specific job that turned out to be adaptable to almost any strike mission the world could offer. By the time the Buccaneer retired from RAF service in 1994, it had outlived every aircraft designed to replace it. The TSR-2, which was supposed to be Britain's next-generation strike aircraft, was cancelled in 1965, a wound the aviation community has never fully forgiven. The F-111K, the American alternative ordered as a substitute, was cancelled in 1968. Both programs collapsed under the weight of cost overruns and political cowardice. The Buccaneer, the stopgap, the fallback, the aircraft nobody outside of Brough and the Fleet Air Arm had initially wanted, kept flying. 35 years of frontline service. Carriers to desert, North Sea to Persian Gulf to the Angolan bush. It outlasted its enemies, its replacements, and the strategic assumptions that had created it. No Buccaneers remain airworthy today. You can find them in museums and on gate guardians across the United Kingdom. Static displays behind rope barriers, canopies closed, painted in squadron colours that fewer people recognise each year. Their engines will never start again. Their rotating bomb bay doors will never turn. The Martin Baker seats will never fire. What survives is the folklore, the ejection briefings delivered with a straight face and a dark grin, the sailor who looked down at a pilot, the swimmer who felt the ocean try to follow an aircraft into the sky, the family in a Highland glen who watched a jet pass below their kitchen window and felt the house shake and the tea slosh, and thought, not for the first time, that they lived in a very strange and wonderful country. Buccaneers over Iraq in 1991. A commemorative paint scheme on a jet in the Nevada desert. A company from Brough that nobody believed could build a legend, and then did. The Buccaneer wasn't glamorous, wasn't fast enough to impress the speed merchants, wasn't agile enough to dogfight, wasn't pretty enough to put on a poster. What it could do was fly lower than anything else ever built, hold that altitude until the fuel ran out or the mission was done, and deliver whatever it carried to whatever needed destroying. The people who built it knew that. The people who flew it knew that. And the people who happened to be standing nearby when it went past, the sailors and swimmers and families in their kitchens, they knew it too. Knew it in a way that no briefing paper or technical manual could ever teach. They felt it in their bones. Some of them felt it in their nosebleeds. The jet from Brough flew past, low and fast and utterly, stubbornly British. And for a few seconds the world rearranged itself around it. Then it was gone. And nothing that came after ever flew quite like it again. Subscribe for more stories like this one.